Hey everybody, and welcome to the first Q&A episode of this show. So this will be the Q&A episode for the first mini season. I'm excited to get into it. It's going to be very freeform compared to the content that we've seen thus far, which has been structured and mostly scripted. So now I'm just going to answer some of the questions that I've received in more of a conversational tone. So let's get right to it. So the first question asked if I have any specific book recommendations about the topics that I've spoke about thus far. And I do. I have a few of them. Let's see. So the first book recommendation that I have is Atomic Habits by James Clear. If you haven't picked it up already, I recommend checking it out. It's a book that speaks about how you can implement tiny actions in order to achieve big results. And so it speaks about a lot of the processes that I've spoke about thus far in terms of taking specific action in a specific direction in your life and looking at the small, minute things that you can change as you go. That's a dramatic reduction in his content, so I highly recommend actually picking up the book or listening to the audiobook. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. And so not only do I highly recommend checking out that book, I will also be referring back to it later on in the show. The second book recommendation that I have is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Now, I like this book a lot because it's one of the core books that relay the tenets of Stoicism. This book isn't really a book in the normal sense. It's more of a private journal. It is actually a private journal of one of the last great emperors of Rome, Marcus Aurelius. He was someone who really embodied Stoicism, and that really shines through in the material. So it's more in the form of journal entries, and it helps to see in the mind of someone who was one of the most powerful people in history and how he kept himself grounded. One of the core tenets of Stoicism is to focus on the things that are within your control and the things that are actionable in your life, and taking your focus away from things that you can't control. And that is a core piece of philosophy that I try to embody in my everyday life as often as possible, because there are so many things that we worry about that are outside of our ability to really affect and control. So the less that I place my focus on those things that I can't control or have no effect over, and the more I place my attention and my efforts on the things that I can control, the less that I worry about things that I can't control. And it's that simple. I'm realizing that these book recommendations are just foreshadowing the content that's coming up in future episodes, but recommendation number 3 is Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl. And just to keep it brief, this is essentially a book that relates the importance of having meaning in one's life in order to sustain them through hard times. So I don't want to spoil too much, but this is one of my favorite books. All of these are some of my favorite books that I've read in the past few years, and this one is definitely in the top 5. Now, book recommendation number 4, I just ask you to keep an open mind because some people may have opinions about this author, but the book is great nonetheless. It is 12 Rules for Life by Dr. Jordan Peterson. No matter what you believe, his personal views aside, this book was incredibly helpful for me. I read it in 2021, I believe, when I was trying to build myself up into a greater version of myself, and this book really helped me along. So if you're looking for a book recommendation, I recommend this one too. So I think those 4 have all been quite general, and when it comes to a specific topic that I've mentioned, I want to recommend this book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, by Dr. Richard Feynman. He's a Nobel laureate in physics, but also he is very well spoken. He's got a great sense of humor. And when it comes to using curiosity as a way to fuel what you're doing in terms of your, career or your projects, this book was one of the books that helped me to shift the way that I approach learning by using curiosity. And so the subtitle of this book is called Adventures of a Curious Character. And he is absolutely a curious character, a funny one, and he's really intelligent as well. So I think you will like this book. Go ahead and check it out if you're interested. Question number 2, did I ever run into negative self-talk during seasons of growth, and if so, how did I and how do I navigate them? That's an excellent question. Excellent indeed. So once I've developed that stable baseline foundation of trusting myself and knowing that I support myself internally, I've tried to get a better sense of how to differentiate between constructive versus destructive or positive versus negative self-criticism. And so this might look something like this. Say I got a C- on a Chemistry 2 exam. Critiquing myself in a positive light, I'd say, okay, I got a C- on this exam. I know that I could have studied harder. I know that I could have spent more time studying instead of going out and partying and doing one thing or another instead of studying and working on more practice problems. Whereas negative forms of self-talk might include something like, I'm just stupid, or I'll never get this, and so on and so forth. So I try to get a good sense of how to differentiate between what forms of self-criticism are positive and which are negative, because self-criticism, criticism in general, critiquing definitely has value, because we're not perfect, we're never going to be perfect, there's always room for growth, and that is a positive way to look at things overall, but it means that we have to be comfortable with understanding that there are ways that we could improve and do better. And so I think shifting it in that light has been helpful for me. And so I do want to say that it was very intentional that the truth was the first piece of structured content that I wanted to share. Starting from a lens of truth, and being able to see things objectively and as they actually are, instead of a perception that I'm not good at chemistry and I'll never be good at chemistry, or I'm not good at algebraic equations, things of that nature. So learning to differentiate what's truth versus perception, and also developing that relationship within myself. There is also an aspect of life in general, as I see it, that we can't know everything. It's impossible for us to know everything. It's impossible for us to know if what we're doing is going to actually yield the results that we'd like to see. So that's why in the episode that I had regarding faith as a subcomponent of it was so important. Sometimes when we can't know the actual outcome, we just have to have faith that if we continue taking steps in the direction that we would like to go, we just have to have faith that things will eventually work out. And if they don't work out the way that we want them to, I've come to a place where I'm able to accept the outcomes as they are, and just being okay with that. That's sometimes really challenging, especially if we like things to go a particular way every single time. So part of my process and part of my journey did involve developing this sense of acceptance for not only myself, but for external situations, and knowing that I can't fully control every single outcome in my life. But I know that if I take steps in the direction of where I would like to go, that I will see at least some positive results. So I hope that helps. Question number 3 asks, how do I navigate feelings of anxiety in terms of knowing what I'm doing is right? So in the sense of self-doubt and uncertainty. And how do I overcome those feelings of self-doubt and uncertainty and believe in myself? Excellent question. So that is a phenomenal question. Thank you for asking. And I do want to preface and say that I don't have any clinically diagnosed forms of anxiety, so I can't speak to that. But I think it is a natural human emotion to feel anxiety in different situations. So from the non-clinically diagnosed perspective, feelings of anxiety are natural and they're normal because we can't know everything, right? We can't know the outcomes that are going to happen in the future. So sometimes I don't know that what I'm doing is right. So I came up with a quote that just happened to come out one day, which is, learn as you do, learn as you go, and all the while be sure that you grow. So I don't know that the things that I'm doing are going to lead to the perfect situation. So that's why it's so important, I think, to specify the ideal that I'm looking to reach, because once you specify that ideal, then you can make actionable steps in order to get closer to that direction. It's a very intentional process. It's a tricky thing because we can talk about it or we can write about it all that we want, but when it comes to making change and making growth in our lives, we have to actually do it, right? We have to actually do the things, take the steps that are going to lead us in that direction. I have to deal with the uncertainty, and I have to deal with the not knowing and all of the challenges and the setbacks that come along with going out and experiencing life and trying something and seeing if it works. And if it doesn't work, then we go back to the beginning. And that's why I think that the order framework is so important, because it forces you first to decide a direction in a way that you want to change, and then actually create a plan, go through the steps of taking those steps in the plan, and then reflecting on it. Did this lead to the outcome that I wanted it to lead to? And if it didn't, then what's something perhaps that I could do differently? Or what did I learn from those steps that I took that took me in a different direction? And is this different direction more favorable than the direction that I wanted to go initially? Who knows? So it's this constant process of acting in the world, reflecting and adjusting as we go. And since we can't know the future, and since we can't know how everything's going to turn out, we just have to have faith that the actions that we take are going to lead us closer in the direction that we would like to go. And things may not work out perfectly, and that's okay. That's actually just life. So it took me a while to be more and more comfortable with that reality, but the more that I've understood that and internalized it and actually continued to act in the world, the more that I came to accept it. Question number 4 asks, how do I trust in other people again after betrayal? And that's a spicy question, and I have an answer. So I think I hinted at it sometime earlier that the first major season of this show is only focused on me, like the self. Eventually in future seasons, I do want to take these concepts and relate them to how we can relate with other people. But for now, I'll give you a preview of what that might look like. So when we talk about influences in a couple mini seasons, we'll talk about what's on this whiteboard here, the rings of influence. So with the rings of influence, there are essentially 3 different key components. There is you in the center, so you have the most influence over your life and what happens in your life. Then there's an inner circle, so you might have heard the concept of the inner circle and having an inner circle of people or friends. And then there's an outer circle. So essentially, the way that I look at the rings of influence is that you control who's in your inner circle and your outer circle, and the people in the inner circle have more access to my time and my energy, whereas the people in the outer influence could be just like regular people on the street or people who I've determined shouldn't have that kind of free range access to my inner energy, right? So in situations where people let me down, or if they betray me or things of that nature, if they were in my inner circle before, then they simply move to my outer circle. The people in the outer ring of influence have relatively little access to my time and energy. So it's a simple step of, you had more access to my time and energy before, and now I'll just simply move you to the outer circle. And it's a lot easier said than done. It still does hurt. So you have to process the hurt and however your emotions manifest on your end and on your time. And sometimes time is the answer because time heals all wounds. I just know that sometimes it takes time, but definitely making the conscious decision to shift someone from the inner circle to the outer circle and giving them a lot less time and energy and access to my time and energy. So that's essentially how I deal with that. I try to limit the negative emotions that I experience on the inside because, as you may have heard, if you get angry or spiteful or vengeful with someone, the only one who experiences that pain and those negative emotions is you. And your body physiologically responds to those negative emotions by producing stress hormones and things that aren't good for our overall health. So I try to, as much as I can, separate myself from those negative emotions. I know that it's going to happen anyway, but I try to limit the amount of time that I'm experiencing those negative emotions by making the decision to limit the amount of time and energy that they have access to in my life and try to move on as early as I can. Again, it's a lot easier said than done, but the more that you practice this and the more that you actually implement it in your life, the better it will be. So I try to keep my inner circle full of people who fill my bucket rather than empty it out. So hopefully that metaphor helps you out. You know, I understand that people have their own natures and people act in ways that are inherently human. You know, not all humans are great. So I try to not take it too personally. That's a huge thing too, is to try to not take their nature personally. So their actions do directly affect you, me, but I try to not take it personally, and I try to say, okay, maybe this is just how this person is. And if I want to live a life that's more positive or more supportive of myself, then I want to keep people who will do things like that, like hurt me or betray me, out of my inner circle. So as often as I can, I try to implement that. The final question is pretty related to the last question, but it refers specifically to how do I detach in different situations. And that is a really, really good question. So that last question makes me think more of Eastern philosophy, perhaps the Buddhist principle of detachment. And it's tricky because in terms of Western culture, some of the philosophical principles don't exactly align. So I'll try to answer that question given that dissonance between the two philosophies. So I know that I'm human and that I experience emotions and that emotions will linger for quite some time. And it's not really directly within our control to just detach from things. And so I will reiterate, as I said earlier in this episode, that time does heal all wounds, but I also try to lean more into my emotions. When it comes to detaching from a situation, I allow myself to feel the emotions and I allow myself to process it. Processing in the sense that in the beginning, in the initial periods, you're just going to feel, and it's just going to suck sometimes. You just have to be okay with that and understand that it's just going to suck. During those initial periods where you have to allow the emotions to run their course, I give myself that grace. And then there comes to be a point where I've felt the emotions that I needed to feel. I've properly grieved the situation, if you will. And then I look towards the future. I have to really look inward. So it's this process of feeling and processing my emotions, but also reflecting and looking forward. And I know that this is a lot easier said than done. Trust me, it takes a long time, and I'm not trying to simplify the process at all and make it sound easier than it is. But given that time to feel those emotions, then afterwards, there comes to be a point where I have to ask myself, you've sat with these emotions, you felt these emotions, you've processed these emotions, you've understood the root cause of it. How can we move forward here? And asking that question becomes more of a logical process. So there's the emotional side and there's a logical side. And both of them have their place in human life, as is the nature of life as humans. And so turning inwards to feel the emotions, to process them, to grieve the negative situations that occurred, also turning towards my inner circle of people who are supportive and doing things that fill my bucket back up, really helped me to find my center again. They help me to find my balance in life. And once I find that balance, then I can then turn towards the future, and then I set goals. Because when we set goals and we, write them down and actively pursue them, it helps to produce dopamine in our system. And I think that I can get away with just saying that without having to back it up with science, but you can actually actually research that if you want. The pursuit towards a goal does actively produce dopamine, which gives us those feel-good feelings that help us to find meaning again. So in those situations, I look to find meaning again in my life. I think that's the answer. And I think that's part of the reason why I recommended a few of those books from before. Because when you have a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose and you're working towards goals, it helps you to feel better again, especially after situations that have made you feel less than great. So I hope that answers your question. So with that, we close out this Q&A episode. I appreciate all of you who have sent in questions, and I really look forward to engaging with you further. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Feel free to reach out to me on any of the social media channels while I take a break of a few weeks, and I look forward to talking to you soon. I hope this episode has been helpful, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. I'll talk to you soon.